I'm Anthony McClaran. I'm CEO of TEQSA, and I'd like to welcome you all here, those of you physically present and those of you watching remotely. Can I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we're meeting today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, both past and present. I mentioned those who are watching this remotely. Do feel free to enhance the remote conversation by tweeting. You'll see the hashtag up there, hashtag TEQSA Forum. And also, if you want Wi-Fi, the network is EA Victoria. The password is 3 at capital V1 Victoria, if you see what I mean. V and then 1 and then the rest of the word Victoria. The notice that tells me what the Wi-Fi address is says this is a shared space, so please be courteous and clean. So with that admonition ringing in our ears, I want to proceed to this afternoon's event. And first of all, to introduce our three speakers. First of all, Lynn Martin, Dr. Lynn Martin, who's been a commissioner at TEQSA since February 2015. Lynn's had a very distinguished career in university administration and management from 2009 to 2011. That's lovely. She was head of university services and vice principal at the University of Melbourne, where she also held the position of vice principal and academic registrar from 2001 to 2005. From 2005 to 2008, Lynn was vice president and council secretary at Deakin University and has held many other senior positions. Our second speaker will be Professor Pip Patterson, appointed Deputy Vice-Chancellor Education at the University of Sydney in June 2014. Responsible for that university's strategy and vision for teaching and learning and students' educational experience. She oversees institutional-wide development of better support for student learning, including the university's approach to curriculum renewal, new thinking in pedagogy, learning and teaching analytics, e-learning, quality assurance for learning and teaching. An exhausting portfolio, Pip. And finally, to welcome Professor Nick Saunders, Chief Commissioner of TEQSA since 2014. Nick was Provost and Deputy VC of Bond University after retiring, I use those words very much in inverted commas, as Vice-Chancellor of the University of Newcastle. Other senior academic roles for Nick have included Dean of Medicine, Nursing and Health Sciences at Monash University, Head of the Faculty of Health Sciences and Dean of Medicine at Flinders, Professor of Medicine at the University of Newcastle, and also positions at McMaster University, Canada, and Harvard, USA. So welcome to all three speakers, all here to talk this afternoon at the first of the TEQSA Occasional Forum series, and the subject is student attrition in higher education. Very topical, and I think the response to this forum and the numbers of people who've come here this afternoon is an indication of the huge interest of this subject at the moment. It's of interest to TEQSA in many ways, but very specifically because attrition is one of the 12 risk indicators in the risk assessment framework that TEQSA uses, and it is by some measure the indicator most likely to trigger either a high or moderate risk rating. 38% of providers at high risk on levels of attrition, 21% at moderate risk. It's a subject that has attracted the attention of the Higher Education Standards Panel, and in their report on admissions transparency, which some of us here have been involved with, they also said that further consideration should be given to assessing the factors and approaches that contribute to student success, completion and attrition rates in higher education. And the Minister picked up that particular point, and many of you will know and indeed may well already have responded to HESP's discussion paper, Improving Retention, Completion and Success in Higher Education, which they issued last month. And there's also a wider policy dimension flagged up in the Higher Education Reform Package that the Minister published in May, where there was some discussion about performance-based funding in the future and the performance measures to which that might be linked. Much detail still to be filled in there. It's true to say, and Lynn will no doubt indicate when she speaks that our report predates all of those more recent policy developments by some way, but it's inevitable in that particular climate that, of course, the elements in this paper will become part of that discussion and debate. I think in terms of a further introduction before handing over to Lynn, I can do no better than use the words that are right at the beginning of the report. Over the last 20 years, there's been significant interest in factors leading to student dropout from first-year higher education studies. Factors identified include a range of personal attributes of the students themselves, as well as academic and administrative aspects of higher education institutions' operations. Concern over attrition is primarily centred on financial and reputational issues for governments and for the institutions. But, the report reminds us, the issue is of considerable significance for the students themselves in terms of wasted time and personal debt. So without any further ado, Lynn, if I could ask you to present the report. Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony. And yes, what an array of interested people before me. It's interesting to see what 200 chairs look like. In fact, we managed to fill the venue. So thanks, Anthony, for the opportunity to talk about the report. I think that the key thing about this report and the analysis that we did is that it was really the first attempt to look at attrition and retention across the whole sector. A lot of work, a lot of public information about universities and their attrition and so forth, but nothing really of a consolidated nature to do with the non-university higher education providers. So that was one of the things that we really wanted to achieve by preparing this report, and I think there are copies somewhere about the copies of this report, and so please feel free to come and get a copy after the discussion is finished, and because there are some quite interesting appendices and so forth in the report. So that's what it looks like. And really, when we, as Anthony said, TEQSA uses 12 performance indicators to assess whether institutions that it is responsible for regulating have, so it identifies the level of risk in terms of these 12 indicators, and one of them, and as Anthony said, attrition is the one that generates the biggest proportion of institutions with high and medium risk. It really stands out when you look at the indicators. So the Commission was interested, therefore, to say, well, what is it about this fairly large spectrum of institutions that we regulate? What is it in the profiles, or the student profile, or the things that the characteristics of the institutions themselves that we might be able to associate with higher levels of attrition rather than lower? So that was how the project started. And to take that a bit further, how could it assist TEQSA in identifying potentially high-risk institutions, and through the conditions and the data that we request as part of the regulation process, perhaps we might be able to identify some strategies that would be good practice strategies to lower attrition. So that was the basis of the project. We worked on the data set that corresponded to the most recent year at the time we started the project. So we were working started working in the second half of 2015, and we were using 2014 attrition data. And there were 173 institutions registered with TEQSA in March 2014, which sort of corresponded to that data year, and 18 of those 173 didn't have sufficient data to actually calculate attrition rates in the way we do and the way we define. And the reason for that is they might have just been starting up, or they might have been tapering off to stop working as an institution. And so that 18 out of 173 really didn't have sufficient data, or data in which we had a great deal of confidence, perhaps is the way to put it. And so if you took that 18 away, that left 155, and we thought about those. But then when we started to look at the nature of the data that we wanted to consider, in fact, a number of the private providers do not submit their statistical data through the Higher Education Information Management System, or HEMS, and in fact we couldn't get the same range of data for all the institutions across those two collections. So in the end we succumbed to lessening the number but to get a complete data set, and so we ended up with 130 institutions, which of course, you know, the public universities are 39 in number, and so that it's a very large proportion of these are non-university higher education providers. So what was the definition that we used? It's the one that's articulated in TEQSA's risk assessment framework, which is quite a technical document, and it's got all the actual definitions and the formulae as to how these 12 performance indicators that TEQSA has identified, how they're calculated. And the definition is there. It's the same sort of definition as used by the Department of Education and Training for the university sector, and it's the same definition that's been used for many, many years. I mean, there's been a continuous time series of data way back to the early 2000s, at least, you know, in my private library at home, and you know, public documentation that's been around in the sector for a long time for the universities. But there are two critical distinctions. This definition, as you see there, it doesn't differentiate between undergraduate and postgraduate students. So in our attrition rates at TEQSA, we look at a first-year student who is starting a postgraduate course as well, and seeing whether they continue or do not. So ours includes both undergraduate and what TEQSA has done here is that our attrition rates are for the whole populations and well, they're for first-year students, but we look at students enrolled in all sorts of levels of courses, so undergraduate and postgraduate. And the difference also is we include domestic and international students, and the Commonwealth only includes in their analyses domestic students. The final thing that there's been a bit of controversy about, I suppose, is that we use what we call raw attrition rates, and it's just using that calculation. But the Commonwealth publishes adjusted attrition rates. Now, the adjustments are made using the student identifier, the CHESN, which is an allocated number, a whole-of-life number for a student in higher education in universities. But, for example, because, and the reason that, well, the reason the CHESN is collected is to try and keep track of resources that are used, that are provided by the Commonwealth. So the CHESN allows the Commonwealth to be able to track students if they, say, start a course at one institution and then they move, that they, in effect, leave the institution, and so they would register as attrition in that institution. But if they go on to continue a course in, doesn't even have to be the same course, in another higher education provider where CHESNs are collected, then the the loss or the attrition is adjusted downwards by the number that have moved, still in higher education but not in that institution. Now the problem is, if you want to do what our aim was, which is to look at attrition across the whole sector, then we need to have the same data for all of the institutions. And because we've got international students in our population group, we can't use adjusted attrition because we have no way of checking how those students, that group of students, would move over time in terms of their tendency to stay or leave higher education. So for those purposes, at least for the 130 institutions that we were looking at, we have used raw attrition rates, and they're all calculated in the same way and using the same protocols, whether or not they're a university or and other type of higher education providers. So that's an important difference. Anthony mentioned risk and how TEQSA operates on a sort of on a risk basis to identify issues that might come up in a registration or accreditation assessment that we look at TEQSA. And so we were interested in thinking, as I said, what the proportions were. And you see this little table. This gives the percentage of institutions that are in the high risk area and the low risk and moderate over the last 3 years. And it's quite a polarised distribution because the percentage in low risk is either the same or just lower than the percentage in high risk. Now that's a very high percentage, of over 40% of institutions of the 130 are actually categorised as high risk institutions in terms of their risk to students through attrition. And so what's been happening is that this has actually been getting slightly worse because the percentage of institutions in the high risk is increasing very slightly, but it's sort of moving across from low risk to moderate risk to high risk. The other thing you notice as soon as you start looking at the whole sector is that there is a considerable diversity of institutions in the higher education sector in Australia, and a wide range of attrition values across these 130 providers. In fact, half the providers have attrition rates greater than 25%. That's the whole profile of the 130 institutions, and the orange ones are the universities, and the blue ones are all other types of higher education providers. So this is when we looked at this, was quite alarming because, you know, when half of the population has an attrition rate of greater than 25%, so you're losing 1 in 4 of the students you recruit in first year, you're sort of not making as much progress as the institutions or the government might expect. And in fact, 25% have attrition rates greater than 31%, and the lower quartile, of course, is 16%. So about a quarter of the 130 are have attrition rates below 16%. So we started to look at this issue of what might the characteristics be that are associated with these high rates of attrition. And at first we thought this is a fairly easy statistical problem. We would do a multivariate regression model for the whole sector, for the whole 130, with all of the data that we had, and see if we could model what significant factors came out in that regression model. But that was not a particularly good fit with the regression model we attempted to fit. And largely on the advice of a statistical consultant we hired, whose name is Alonzo Matter. Alonzo, are you here? Yes, he's up the back. Alonso was keen to try clustering groups across the sector and seeing whether it was possible to get better fits with these subsets using the information that we had about each provider. And so Alonso's view was that we could do better by segmenting the sector, and his advice was to do this by using hierarchical cluster analysis, which is a sort of developmental type statistical procedure. And we used 17 variables, which are described in the copies of the report. They're in Appendix 2. In fact, the whole range of variables we used, there were 36 of them, and we used 17 of the 36 to discriminate within the clusters, within the whole sector, to provide the clusters. So, and really the purpose was the cluster analysis, in the sort of layperson's term that I understand, is that clustering should produce groups which have more in common with each other than differences between each other. And so that was the purpose of doing it. I hope you can see that. So this is what, using a statistical package called R, this is what the outputs look like from that. And you can see that these clusters or groups of this tree structure come out fairly distinctively, and the length of the bars, the sort of vertical lines, is an indication of how far away from the rest of the population in the clusters that particular group is. So after much development work, I suppose I'd call it, we came up with this model using the R package. And in fact, it turns out that the cluster 1 consists of the universities. There's no non-university higher education provider in that first cluster. The second, and of course we know that the universities are pretty large institutions usually, and so they have a number of characteristics that make that, but we'll talk a little bit about that later. The second cluster is a group of very small institutions, around about 400 EFSL on average for each institution, and they are a group where the predominant factor is that they have a student population that is very much in the large in the society and culture field of study, and they in fact tend to be the faith-based institutions, and their students are studying, religious studies and philosophy and so forth like that. So they came as a group. The third one is the smallest group of the four, the smallest cluster of the four, and that they are medium-sized institutions. They're about 800 EFSL each, so they're a step different to cluster 2, but not nearly as big as the universities on average. And that group is a group that's focused on international students as part of its profile, and a big enrolment in business and economics or commerce. And the final cluster is a set of institutions that enrol largely domestic students, and they cover a wide range of fields of study and so forth. So they're very different, and most of the private providers are in cluster 3 or cluster 4. So it's just a summary of it, I suppose. Clusters defined according to their profile. We looked at average values for each segmentation variable, every variable that we used to segment the population, and that drove the output in the R system. So, as I said, there were 4 groups, and I think I've gone through those, but they are very distinctive groups when you look at them and you take it down to a combination of things such as the field of study, the student profile of that, and where the main catchment is, I suppose, for each institution. So these are those four groups. Same sort of chart as the one that was for the whole sector, and you notice these are not to the same scale, so sort of don't just look at it and think that, well, that one's worse than that because the scales are different. But the cluster one, which was the universities, on average, the median rate is 18%, the attrition rate. The average is slightly higher, it's about 20. Cluster 2, which were the small institutions that were faith-based, and you can see that by the incidence of the grey bars in the chart. And immediately the average or the median attrition rate has gone up to 27%. Cluster 3, which was the internationally oriented, you see the number of orange bars there, they're the for-profit institutions. So these are private providers that are running their business for profit. Interestingly, the median there, which is 20%, is not that different from the universities one, but when you actually calculate the average, it's about 27%, because there's all these higher attrition institutions up the far end. And final one, which was that mixture group, but a large group of 41 institutions, the median attrition rate there is 28%, which is, quite high, really. So once we got the institutions into those clusters and could see the different characteristics that were there in the basic plots of the data, we then tried to fit similar multivariate regression analysis model to each of the clusters. And this chart, if you look at the columns, so cluster 1, which was the universities, what this chart depicts is those variables that came out through that regression analysis as being the significant variables. So you might think that these were the significant facts. So if we look down the university cluster, the factors that came out were the percentage of external students that were there, the percentage, the size, the total FSOL of the institution. The VET one is an interesting one because it is not the proportion of students that might be in a multi-sector institution that VET, it's the proportion of the intake that has come from a VET background. So students admitted on the basis of VET, so of the total student population. And that one I think is an interesting characteristic in terms of the universities, because it's not something that, in my experience in universities, there's sort of not a great tendency, or hasn't been in the past, to admit students on the basis of their studies. Proportion of senior academic staff employed, the proportion of postgraduate students out of the total enrolment. Now, so out of the 36 variables that we had, these five came out as the most significant. Now, the signs after them indicate the direction that the inference is. So a plus means that a larger number is associated with the larger number is associated with increased attrition. So, for example, external, the higher the proportion of external students in the institution, the higher the attrition is likely to be. With the FSOL, the smaller the institution is, the higher the attrition is found to be. So they give, they're not predictors, they're explainers of the patterns in the data. And so if you look, I won't go through all of these, but you can see how they differ between the various clusters. And there's one fairly low group, the cluster 2, that isn't a very good fit. But getting R-squared or adjusted R-squared rates of 86%, that's extremely good. So it shows how coherent, I suppose, the universities are in terms of this. But 57% and 58% is an acceptable level of variance in the model. So you also see from that slide that there are several characteristics, like the VET appears both in cluster 1, cluster 2, cluster 3. The full-time academic staff, they appear in 3 and 4, and the senior academics appear in 1 and 4. So you can see that the models are not the same, but we're getting, as a whole, a much better fit than just looking at the sector as a whole without looking at any of the relationships that might exist between the institutions within the cluster. So that, I suppose, is the major finding from this study. And I suppose I've summarised those by saying there are explainers of attrition that are specific to certain segments, that is the clusters, but some affect multiple sections of the higher education sector. And what one of the things that was surprising, because we did include these variables in the modelling, that our analysis didn't reveal any strong link to ATAR values in universities. But I must stress that our data that we're working with is aggregated data. So we'll be looking at, for example, the percentage of students in the secondary school assessment that might have an ATAR value of a certain range and so forth. But if what's in the press was actually being of real significance, and what's been in the press is that the sector's quality is declining because the ATAR values, the students are being admitted with lower ATAR values. And in fact, that certainly doesn't come up as a major determinant of attrition. Also, there's no link to low socioeconomic status, etc., as appears there. And if we just look, this isn't to do with our study, it was just background that we looked. Australia's completion rates, which of course is sort of an inverse, I suppose, of attrition, shows that Australia is about the OECD average in terms of that. So the OECD average is 70%, and the UK and the US have considerably better completion rates than Australia. So that's why this is such an important issue. Okay, so I'll just finish off because we're a bit delayed. As far as we're concerned at TEQSA, this work does give us more information about the factors that are involved with higher levels of attrition or lower levels of attrition in the sector. And so it sort of points a way forward. One of the reasons that the work we did, which was at the institutional level, not the individual student level, which is what the cohort analyses do, at what we do at TEQSA is look in terms of regulation, so registration of an institution. So we're interested in institutional level data, less about what the specific mix looks like in terms of the students. So we do collect some data on that. And so we thought that an approach like this, which is somewhat different to the usual approach, which is usually cohort analysis at the individual student level. So what we thought was that this approach of looking at institutional data, looking at clusters and groups fitted very well with the regulatory processes that we currently use, and that's why we did this. So I'll leave it there and hope that the PowerPoint holds up for you, Pip.
Thank you very much, Lynn, and thank you for your stoic reaction to the technical difficulties. Without any further ado, if Pip Patterson could now come, and Pip is going to respond to some of the points made in that research. Thanks, Pip.
Thank you, Anthony, and thank you, Lynn. It is a pleasure to be here to respond, and I would like to start by thanking TEQSA for initiating this kind of analysis. I think the more we discuss important issues like attrition rates with a lot of data in front of us, the much more progress we'll make on really identifying those factors that make a difference. So I'm going to briefly touch on 4 points, and I'll go as quickly as I can because I know we're delayed. But I'll start by saying why I think this institutional level analysis is so important. I'll make a few statistical remarks about this kind of analysis, which Lynn hasn't emphasised, but which are actually clearly set out in the report. And then just a few brief remarks on what I think we've learnt and where we might go next. So, to begin with, of course this analysis is helpful because it's more analysis, it's more evidence, it increases our understanding of our sector. And I think I'd particularly point to our capacity to have a much richer understanding of the variation and heterogeneity in the sector. But in addition to that, and this is certainly the case for people in roles like mine, we often think about issues like attrition or completion rates for students as institutional problems, and we set strategies at institutional level. So understanding the picture from an institutional point of view is actually very important and very helpful for us. I think it's also very interesting that the analysis that was published in the Higher Education Standards Panel report, Improving Retention, Completion and Success, showed actually that institutions were a major source of variation in modelling attrition at the student level, which points to the value of actually looking at the institutional level as a way of advancing understanding. And then finally, as many people have commented about the Australian higher education sector, it is a heterogeneous one, and the more we can do to understand that, the better. And I think the analyses that Lynn has just described both improve our understanding of the sector and its characteristics, but also of how they play into the prediction of attrition. And here's just the statistical point. I used to teach statistics, so I can't help myself. It is important, of course, with any study that takes a body of data and fits a regression model. We obviously can't infer causal relationships from a regression or any kind of correlation. We can't conclude that there are corresponding correlations that we identify through this analysis at the institutional level. We can't infer that they also exist at the level of individual students. And that's an important point, and I think that point about ATAR that Lynn just emphasised is a good example of that. We do have the entire population of institutions in this analysis, so that makes for some interesting thoughts about the nature of inference in this circumstance. I can elaborate on that if you want later. And of course, in any study that aims to provide an explanatory model, what's missing from the model needs to be in the back of our minds always. And so there might be some important characteristics of institutions that are not included here that, had we included them, might change the picture we see. I was reading a US study recently which used expenditure per student, expenditure on student services as a predictor, and found that to be quite important. So that would be an example of such a thing that might be missing. And of course this is, as Lynn has said, a very exploratory analysis. But we've learnt a lot from it, I think. I think that description of the sector that Lynn just gave us really articulates a much richer and better sense of the sector as a whole, and that's valuable. And as Lynn also emphasised, some of the relationships we saw are important in a number of settings, both across the whole set of providers, but also within one or more clusters. And clearly, things like size, the comprehensiveness that goes with size and with having a large postgraduate population, the depth of expertise that we hope goes with having a high proportion of senior academics. These are important, and that's, I think, affirming to see. But also the compositional aspects of the student body, a large number of external students, part-time students, students admitted on the basis of it. It's very interesting to understand those relationships between compositional factors for an institution and the attrition rate at the institutional level. And as Lynn also emphasised, it's really interesting to see what's missing from this analysis. Things like median tertiary entry scores, student staff ratios, satisfaction measures, employment outcomes, and SES. Now that's not to say that those factors are not important at the individual level, and I'll say a bit more about that at the moment, but it is interesting that in terms of composition that they weren't important here. And of course a really vital point is that the analysis that Lynn presented shows that there's important variation across the various clusters. So we have a very rich level of heterogeneity, both in the nature of the institutions in our sector and in the ways in which attrition plays out in those different parts of the sector. So I'm going to focus the rest of my remarks on where I think, you know, this should take us going further. And what immediately struck me was how valuable it would be to put together the kind of institutional data set that has allowed this analysis to take place with a student level data set, so that we can begin to try and understand attrition or success or completion in its full multi-level complexity. And of course, when we think about attrition, it's not hard to imagine that both student level and institutional level characteristics must be important to really understanding what's going on in what is fundamentally quite a complex process embedded within a multi-layered system. And if we look at the research literature on attrition and degree completion, we find conceptual models that propose this and indeed are supported by analyses in other countries. I couldn't actually find any multi-level analysis of Australian data, possibly because the data sets have not been combined in a way that would allow that, but I do think that would be an interesting step to take. But certainly in other countries there are some interesting examples of the kind of analysis I think it would be useful to do. The study I mentioned there by Chen even incorporates longitudinal data of students over a 6-year period, trying to understand the progressive loss of students through that process, either to actually degree completion or leaving their degree. These sorts of, whoops, to figure out how to go back. Oops, wrong way. The sorts of conceptual models that I think it would be very interesting to explore are illustrated by this one from 2009, some US authors who have aimed to model attrition both at the student level and institutional level simultaneously, which is what a multi-level model would allow. At the individual student level, characteristics of the students, like their background, their experiences, their attitudes, and indeed features in their own local setting, for example, financial considerations, the opportunities for employment. All of those might impact on their individual probability to actually remain in study and go on to complete their degrees. And in addition to that, there's an institutional propensity for, or impact on that probability, which is then in turn at another level modelled in terms of compositional and structural characteristics of the institutions themselves, including potentially some aspects of the climate of those institutions that might be measured by various ways in which students express their intention to stay, or they may reflect staff views about the importance of teaching in an institution, or the importance of retention and completion of degrees by students in that environment. And then that those two levels then constitute a single model, which allows us to unpack both the individual impacts on a student of particular characteristics, as well as the compositional characteristics of that student cohort on the institutional level effects. And when, and here's an example of the findings of a study of that kind, quite a large study, 37,000 students from 170 four-year colleges and universities in the US, using a similar kind of methodology at one level, relying on national surveys that are completed by students in those institutions on a sampled basis, and then looking at whether or not students have completed after 6 years, plus integrating into that some data about the institution from other sources, in this case from a survey of the staff of those institutions. And in a multi-level model, finding that certainly a lot of the variation is explained by student level effects and student compositional effects. In that case, many of the similar things that we would expect to be important here. But then in addition to that, the capability of showing that actually some of the sort of structural characteristics of the institutions matter, the perceived climate in relation to a culture of educational excellence matters a little bit, but in this large study enough to make a difference. And then some aspects of climate of the institution which students themselves can report through their annual reporting of their expectations of whether or not they will complete. And so together that, I think, illustrates the kind of analysis that we might hope to go on to next, where we can look at both student and institutional level impacts. And then one last couple of points. The next thing I would add is that, in fact, Lynn's study has, this study has shown how important institutional heterogeneity is. But when we look inside individual institutions, they're not all homogeneous either. And I think many of us, where we look carefully, we find variations that are quite substantial from one program to another. And so I think we can use some of the same methods that I've just described to actually understand heterogeneity within institutions much more clearly, and therefore in ways which will allow us to act more purposefully and helpfully. The third point I'd make then is that it's really interesting, once we have some sense of these baseline models about student characteristics, compositional characteristics, broad characteristics of an institution, what can we do as institutions to then drive degree completion to higher rates and reduce attrition in the process? And here I think there are a lot of very promising and really quite exciting initiatives underway, both here and in other parts of the world. I was going to just mention these two, but I'll add a third. One is, I think many institutions are making much better use of data to understand the early signs of an intention to abandon study, and are actually ensuring that, that they're providing the support they can to ensure that those sorts of decisions are made in ways that really are best for individual students. I do remember a student giving me her business card many years ago as she left halfway through first year to start a very successful business. Some attrition, I think, does come because people really do have very attractive alternatives in front of them at a particular moment in time. And so I think the more we actually understand the broader picture, the more carefully we can appraise these kinds of initiatives. And here I've mentioned the Student Relationship Engagement System, which was developed at the University of Sydney and is being used in a couple of different places, but there are many different examples of that kind. And then the second is some very exciting brief values affirmation interventions that have been developed by Jeffrey Cohen and colleagues at Stanford University, which are having quite dramatic effects used in appropriate ways to reduce the achievement difference between students who come from cultural minority groups into a majority culture setting. And I think, again, that's an example of something which we could evaluate with much better data on what other factors need to be understood in order to evaluate that effect. And then finally, and not mentioned here on the slide, of course, I think we're all thinking about ways of presenting information to students in ways that will help them make better choices at each step along the way. And I think, government's thinking about that, everyone's thinking about that. I think the more we can evaluate attempts to present information in ways that allow us to actually assess their impact, again, the more quickly we'll hone in on some really effective strategies. So let me finish by, again, thanking TEQSA for the report. We've been very interested in my institution to discuss it, and I'm sure that's true around the sector. And I think that probably explains the large number of you that are here today. So thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Pip. I would like now to ask Pip if you could take one of those chairs. Lynn and also Nick Saunders are going to take the chairs at the front there. I will attempt to deal with the questions from here, I think, because it's far easier to see hands going up from this position. This is an opportunity for questions, either to Lynn about the research, to Pip about that very productive set of responses and suggestions and pathways for future work, and to Nick in terms of the view of TEQSA. We've stressed already the view of TEQSA, the starting point around risk assessment, but of course there's another aspect, which is our wish to work with the sector to point to and to encourage and to support some of those instances that I think Pip was referring to of good practice. What are the interventions that can actually make a positive impact upon attrition, issues of attrition? And thanks also, Pip, for bringing into the frame right at the end there the link between attrition and a much wider series of questions, which I guess I just very slightly touched on in my introduction around student decision making, and that of course links into the whole agenda around transparency and admissions transparency, which is a particular preoccupation for TEQSA and many of us in the sector at the moment. So let me pause and throw this open to the floor and ask you if you have any questions. I see one immediately. A roving mic will find you, I think, just on the outside, and then the next question is just in front. The microphone will find you. Raf, just on the outside there. And if you could say who you are and where you're from, that would be helpful.
Alan Farley, Victoria University. A question for Lee. Having done a similar analysis myself 2 years ago with 5 years of data, comparing your results to mine raises a number of very interesting issues. The first is that I did only +1, of course, interested in the universities for my analysis. And having only university data, I could differentiate types of attrition. And so I did my analysis using attrition in the form of loss to sector and attrition in the form of loss to other universities as 2 separate analyses. And that, looking at my results for that, it highlights one of the issues that might arise in your analysis. In doing that, I find that I get variables that act in opposite directions. The same variable acts in opposite directions on 2 different types of attrition. Perfect example is regional. Being regional tends to have a bad effect in terms of loss to sector, but it tends to have a good effect in terms of loss to other universities, I think, for a fairly obvious reason. And so, by using the single measure, you are actually perhaps getting variables coming up as not significant because they are in fact having opposite effects on the 2 types of attrition. So that's the first issue that comes out of looking at my analysis. The second is one that surprised me considerably. You say that you looked at ATAR. I used as one of my variables the average ATAR of domestic students admitted to each university, commencing students. Using just that variable, I could explain 75% of the variation of loss to sector, attrition loss to sector. So I am stunned to hear that you could not find any effect at all on ATAR. Even on loss to other universities, I could get an R squared of 55% just with that variable. And so certainly, to me, it appeared to be a very major factor. In fact, the most significant factor in my analysis. So I'm very interested to hear exactly what measure you used for ATAR.
Well, I think Pip, in fact, used it among us. It was the proportion of students admitted.
It was the median.
The median.
The median ATAR.
The median ATAR. Yep. Right. Having a good day with technology. I think, Alan, the reason that some of these patterns don't come up too is because there is that enormous diversity when you're looking at 130 institutions with quite different profiles. A lot of the private providers, they will only have, or the vast majority of their students would be international students, for example. And so I'm not surprised that, sometimes we don't even get ATAR scores associated with that. So I'm not surprised that when you look at the whole sector, it doesn't come up as quite so finely defined as your study has. But we do get, as that chart at the end showed, you do get patterns coming in that use the same variables but are reflected in different ways, some positive, some negative, and so forth. So I'm not surprised you got results like you did, but I think you can't underestimate the variety and the fact that this is a multivariate analysis, not a univariate analysis just within one variable.
Thanks, Lynn. I'm anxious to get more questions in. There was one just in front, I think. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Great presentation, very exciting. John Rich, I'm a private provider, and I've also spent many years to be paid here in the TAFE sector, putting together higher education programs as well. A couple of interesting points, failure rates and attrition rates. Has there been any analysis with regards to subject failure rates and attrition rates, the two correspond? respond, is there any relationship between the two? And once again, what analysis? Secondly, with regards to the vet students going into articulating into hiring, that's been very, very problematical, especially working in the vet side, because we have a lot of our students came through the vet side. And I noticed, when I did the analysis on the student level, that most of our students who actually had advanced standing were the ones who had the greatest problems. Going back many, many years prior to training packages, when the courses at training institutes were predominantly curriculum-based, a lot of our students actually ended up going through the university quite successfully. I'm just wondering if there's been any analysis done on the impact of training packages being delivered at AQF 6, AQF 5, and the advanced standing and the changes in the way that those training packages have been implemented, and what effect does that have on the attrition rates? Okay, thank you.
Well, I'm not sure that I can answer a lot of that. But I think the first point you talked about was there any relationship between sort of passing within a year and so forth? And that's an interesting thing, because you would expect, I suppose, just thinking from first principles, that if you had a high, what we call progress rate, which is really a pass rate within a year, if you had high pass rate within the year, you wouldn't expect to have high attrition, and vice versa. And in fact, one of the clusters that I put up in that chart, and it's in the report, so I've got a copy of it, I think it was cluster 3, which was the medium-sized international business type area. That is the only one of the 4 clusters that are variable. The lower the progress rate, the lower the within-year pass rate, the higher the attrition. And that was the only one of the 4 clusters. So that's the only thing that we have on that. As for the detailed information about their training packages and so forth, we haven't done anything on that, though we do keep in close contact with the vet providers, because we have a number of dual sector providers that those are issues that we're interested in. This is the first of the occasional series about, I think that's about all I can say.
Pip, is there anything that you want to say on the training packages?
No, I'm not really able to say anything, but I do think the fact that you've asked those questions in this setting, that's just so it's such a wonderful demonstration of the value of doing some analysis, which invites the next set of questions, which invites the next set of analyses.
Thank you very much. I'd like to take some more questions, please. Hands up. Do we have any more? Yes, there's one there. Thank you.
Thank you. Diana Speeds in College of Divinity, right in the middle of class 2.
Yeah.
I see on page 30 the comments from the report that's looking to the future, the strict definition, which uses the raw figure attrition, needs review because of the changing nature of various factors in the sector. And we found it to be a very helpful report, helping us position ourselves to see where we are. So we're certainly very appreciative of this and of the very thoughtful work that's gone into the way it's approached. Thank you very much for being involved with that. One of the most obvious things that would seem to me review right across the sector, not just cluster 2, it's got some particular things in it, is the business of counting as attrition, nested reward changes. You can't win if you enroll someone in your first year, bachelor level diploma, and to see if they're all right so that they can go up. That becomes attrition. If you enroll them in the bachelor and they really you can't make it and have to exit a diploma, he says you're also attrition. And I would have thought pretty much the whole sector would be interested in seeing, something perhaps done about that.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm going to direct that one to Nick. Nick, definitions of attrition and how they're currently used and how they might be used in the future.
Well, it's a very important point, and it goes beyond, I think, the technical definitions of institutions that one runs 3 trimesters and whether the students are completing in a calendar year or not, which does cause problems in the calculations. But as we look to the future, of course, there's going to be more and more students undertaking what is now being called micro-credentialing, industry-based or authentic learning. They'll be bundling those credentials up in various ways. They'll be dipping in and out of their education as their workplace requires them to develop new knowledge and skills. And now how you actually measure, in fact, what is the meaning of attrition in that context, I think is a very important point. And then the second point that you make about trying to do the best for the students and being punished for it, I mean, I think that's also a very important point to keep in consideration. I mean, TEQSA has been brave enough, I think, recently to say that a reasonable benchmark would be completion rates of 80% in N plus 2 years. So for a bachelor degree, 80% completion rate in 5 years, that would be a reasonable benchmark. That's like the UK and the US is achieving. However, having said that, why should we punish an institution who deliberately is taking in less academically qualified students according to the measures at high school and trying to give them an opportunity to actually complete a higher education degree? So there is no magic number. I think it's important. I think the most important thing is for institutions to be aware of their students' progress, of their students' attrition, taking some efforts to measure what is happening and why it's happening, and then putting in place appropriate support mechanisms to promote the chances of the students succeeding. I mean, I think that's a very important point that's been made.
It is, Pip. I think you'd like to comment.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to thank you for the question. I just wanted to say that I think the more we think about questions like this, the more we realise that our students are on quite complex and diverse trajectories in education. They enter at different points, they dip in and out in different ways, and I think to really understand what's going on, we probably need to be able to understand those trajectories in a much richer way, just as we've started to understand the richness of the institutional setting. We need to understand the trajectories over time that our students take.
Thank you. Yes, question on the aisle here.
It's going to be probably loud enough anyhow.
Well, it helps with the recording as well, so thank you. Okay.
Stephen Nichols with Higher Education. Can I just continue the debate about attrition? Because in your introductory remarks and also in your report, it talks about attrition in terms of individual students, of wasted time, and it talks about financial burden. And I guess the question you would ask is 1 year of higher education better than none? You know, we might all agree that 3 years is better than 1, but is it equally true that that 1 is better than none? In at least 3 ways. The first way is a student who only completes 1 year. Over their lifetime, is their income greater than someone who hasn't had higher education? Number 2, we happen to believe about values we give people in education in terms of problem solving, critical analysis, etc. So they gain that in 1 year. And I guess we also believe that education has got some public good aspects to it. So is it better to have a society where at least part of the population has 1 year of education at higher level than none? So attrition may be bad, but it's not all bad.
Thank you very much for that question. Now that raises really important issues about, recognition of learning that has been accomplished, even when a complete program has not been completed. I'd like to ask the panel for comments on that. the terminology, and I guess I ought to start with you, Lynn, as there was a quote from the report there. The terminology of waste and burden is perhaps not giving us the right perspective for looking at this issue.
Yes, I mean, point taken, I think. But I guess for the vast majority of the years that there has been interest in the public domain in attrition, it has been using that sort of language. But of course, I've spent a lot of my life working in universities, in fact 8 in Australia in my long administrative career. And these have been a range of universities, new ones that are having difficulty perhaps filling quotas and so forth, as well as the group of 8. And I agree with you that in a lot of those institutions, I don't mean to ghettoise them, but in a lot of those institutions, seeing the benefits that come from students who probably didn't ever think they would even come to university, and this was all about universities, so I apologise to the private providers about that. But I do think there are great benefits, and from my own view, I would really like us to, in parallel, and if the Minister's thinking about his performance fund, to actually try and get a bit better fix on what students have actually learned. So to try and understand that even if they leave early, what are the skills and the attributes of the learning outcomes that they have been working towards in various subjects and so forth of their course of study. And I wouldn't like it to think that the only performance issue was getting that attrition rate down. I'd like to get some more qualitative information as well as the quantitative to back up whether it is a loss, or at least that it's not as great a loss as it appears to be from the raw numbers.
I'm just going to ask Pip if she wants to comment on whether a student who leaves Sydney after a year has wasted their time or money. That's not loaded in any way whatsoever. Then I'm going to ask Nick for any final responses or reflections he has on the points that have been made, and then we will draw the formal part of the proceedings to a close. You may be pleased to hear that we would love you to join us for a drink, and the informal discussion can continue. Drinks are, as I speak, set out at the back of the room. But Pip first, then Nick, and then we'll close the proceedings. Thanks.
Well, very briefly, I'll dodge that question, but I have seen some research which does show some benefits, I think, in terms of earnings in later life from partial completion of tertiary study. So, and I think it is fundamentally an empirical question. Of course, we also see some cases of students who can be quite distressed by failure, and for whom I don't think it's a good experience. So I think there are both probably positive and negative impacts. And I do agree with Lynn that we as a sector do need to get a good handle on what our students are learning. And at Sydney we've just commenced a major project to actually assess learning outcomes across the institution using a common framework, as well as the normal assessments that students do about their knowledge and skills. So I think it will be interesting to see to what extent those sorts of approaches emerge over time.
Thank you. Nick, the report was not the end of this matter for TEQSA, but very much a beginning. So any reflections on what you've heard so far?
Yes, well, I think what we've heard today, it really shows the power of having data to examine and have a conversation about the different ways in which that data can be interrogated, and the different perspectives that can be brought to bear on the findings, the complexity of the issue, and the difficulties of taking a simplistic view of a matter as complex as student success or attrition, and indeed then try to translate that into any sort of dollar and cents outcome. I think it's really important that the sector has a broad discussion about this, and there are learnings to be made both from the most successful universities through to small private providers, and somehow or other we've got to get that conversation going. So it's not all just about what's going on in universities. So, Anthony, I'd like to thank you for encouraging us to put on this first occasional series. We will be having other occasional series forums in the months to come. We'd be interested to hear from the sector the sorts of issues that you would want to bring forward, as well as us thinking up things to bring to you. Thanks to Lynn and Alonso for driving the project at TEQSA and the staff that assisted there with the information and the analysis. Thanks to Pip for giving a very thoughtful and helpful response to the findings. Thanks to Engineers Australia, and particularly to the IT engineer who successfully remedied the difficulties that we were facing. Thanks to Karen Trelaw and the staff of TEQSA who's organised tonight. These things just don't happen, and we do appreciate the hard work of the staff in doing this. And thanks to you all for coming to Melbourne and participating in this discussion. And we really do encourage, I think, engagement between those who are providing higher education in Australia with us, the regulators. So thanks very much to you all.
Thanks, Nick. And again, yeah, thank you all very much, and let the discussion now continue informally over a drink at the back of the room. Thank you.
Yes, well done.